neuron signals get from end to end of the same neuron using an action potential, and then the signal gets from one neuron to another neuron with synaptic transmission. But the fact is that sending information to the brain and from the brain involves chains of many neurons signaling with action potentials and synaptic transmission. And this is video 7.6 on nerve circuits. We'll focus on this one objective, how neurons form circuits to take information to and from the brain. Now, what I'm talking about with a nerve circuit is the chain of neurons, like this chain of neurons right here, that allows you to feel a sensation or stimulus, send information about that stimulus to your brain, and have your brain process that information and send signals back to react to the stimulus. Now, to better understand, it's important to lay some groundwork with a few terms. All right, first, it's important to understand that the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of neurons that start and end in your brain and spinal cord. And in contrast, the peripheral nervous system has neurons with either axons or dendrites outside of the brain and spinal cord. So roughly, we can say that the central nervous system neurons are either brain neurons or spinal cord interneurons, and we'd call neurons in the peripheral nervous system peripheral neurons. Now, another division of the nervous system signaling is the sensory division and the motor division. The sensory division, senses stuff. In other words, the sensory division sends information to the brain. Now, the motor division of the nervous system carries out actions. Information from the brain is sent through the motor division to a target organ or effector organ, and that organ can change its activity based on the signals the organ receives. Now, to build a full circuit here, you see that there's sensory information going from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system, and then motor information going from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system. One thing to keep in mind is that a neuron can only send a signal in one direction, from its dendrites to its axons. So a neuron can be either a sensory neuron or a motor neuron, but not both. All right, so how does this relate to what we've been studying? Well, for each of these neurons in the chain, an action potential gets the signal from the dendrites to the axon of that neuron. So in this diagram, there's 4 neurons, so 4 action potentials. Action potential, action potential, action potential, action potential. And then for each of those neurons to talk to the next neuron, there has to be synaptic transmission. So synaptic transmission, where the neurons talk to each other, here, here, and here. And the overall signal would go action potential, synaptic transmission, action potential, synaptic transmission, and so on. Let's see how this would look more anatomically. All right, so here's a sensory pathway where there's a sensation felt by the skin, and a peripheral sensory neuron sends information this way to the spinal cord and a spinal neuron, and then the spinal neuron relays the information to your brain, and specifically a part of the brain called the sensory cortex. Then, coming away from the brain is a motor pathway, shown right here. Now, your sensory cortex in your brain actually talks to the motor cortex in your brain. And then brain neurons from the motor cortex send signals down to the spinal interneurons that relay the information out to peripheral motor neurons that cause a reaction, just like muscle contraction and movement. And I got thrown off here because this arrow should be pointing to the left. Now, sometimes actions need to be taken quicker than other times. When a quick action is needed, the body can use reflex circuits. A reflex is an automatic subconscious response. And a classic example of a reflex that we've all experienced at the doctor's office is a knee-jerk reflex. You know, when the doctor hits your knee with a hammer during a physical exam and you have no control and you kick out your leg. Now, from a biological perspective, the reason reflexes can happen so fast is because the neuron circuitry bypasses the brain. Let's check it out. Here's a reflex arc for a withdrawal reflex. So let's say you touch a hot pan on the stove. Now, sensory neurons in your finger will send information to your central nervous system right here in the spinal cord, but with a reflex circuit, the spinal cord interneuron immediately sends information to motor neurons that move your hand away from that painful stimulus. And in a case like this, your body is hardwired to limit exposure to this danger. Now, don't get me wrong, the information still goes up to your brain, but by the time your brain senses pain, your body is already taking action to get away from that harmful stimulus. I like this diagram because it lets us compare a reflex arc to a full nerve circuit. A reflex circuit bypasses the brain to create a simple, rapid, involuntary response. A full nerve circuit, shown here in red, adds in the brain with the superpowers of decision-making and conscious thought, but that conscious thought requires time, and sometimes when the stimulus is pain, you just don't have the time. I wouldn't have guessed that drinking water is a reflex, but maybe that person just really thirsty. All right, so let's recap. The nervous system is broken up into the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system, everything else that's not your brain and spinal cord. Sensory neuron signals send information from your body to the central nervous system, but motor neuron signals send information from your central nervous system to your body. And we can think of a nerve circuit as that sensory information coming in and that motor information going out. Now, when the brain receives that information, the brain can integrate information to make decisions before taking action. But when a quicker action is needed, the body often uses a reflex circuit or a reflex arc instead to bypass the brain for a speedier response.